Record to the cloud. All right. Okay, everyone. Great. So welcome back to another installment of the UQ Philosophy Seminar. And today we are going to have the pleasure of having Stephen Muecke speaking, who will be talking about Aboriginal philosophy of some kind. So we will learn about that, and this is a very well attended talk. As we can see, evidently it's a very interesting topic, and hopefully we look forward to a lively discussion as well. So please, Stephen, the floor is all yours. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Guillermo, for inviting me. I don't often talk to philosophy departments, so this is exciting and apprehensive. I'm talking to you from Ghana country, the Adelaide Plains, and I'd like to acknowledge elders here, past, present, and emerging, and elders in the audience and over there in Mianjin, where you are. So, Indigenous philosophy for gardiyas. So, 20 years ago, I published a book called Ancient and Modern: Time, Culture, and Indigenous Philosophy, in which I tried to attribute a little more complexity to the uptake of Aboriginal knowledges. Taking the opportunity to think about it again today, I realized what I tried to do then was, in a way, open the door to the possibility of an academic field of Indigenous philosophy. As you know, there was no Aboriginal history until the 1970s, and the journal was started then. So in Australia, there is, of course, a massive knowledge of Indigenous Australians, which has been consolidated and refined over 60,000 years, and largely filtered and translated in departments of anthropology, history, English, cultural studies a bit, but philosophy, for the most part, continues to take little interest. Although there was a short entry called Australian Aboriginal Philosophy by Max Charlesworth in the companion to Philosophy in Australia and New Zealand. He characterised the possibility of an Indigenous philosophy as being folkloristic. And John Passmore in 1992 said, called it mythologies. He said, one obvious way in which we might stake out a claim for there being in Australia a wholly Indigenous philosophy, neither cosmopolitan nor neo-colonial, is by counting the very distinctive Aboriginal mythology as philosophy. And he goes on, a ridiculous suggestion? Well, the Cartesian observation has not lost its force, that there is no doctrine so preposterous, but that some philosopher has maintained it. But then, since those old guys were talking, Indigenous philosophers have emerged. Mary Graham, Wanta Jambajimpa Pau, Max Bretti in your department, Reg Dodd, though he wouldn't call himself a philosopher, and nor would Bill Neji, Paddy Rowe, David Maljali, whose words have been used philosophically, but they don't call themselves philosophers. So the traditions in philosophy departments continue to be European, Northern Hemisphere, divided, as you know, between continental philosophy, schools of logic, and so on. I myself don't claim any capacity for philosophy. I'm operating without a license, driving like I stole it. Nor in Indigenous knowledges, all I'm claiming is the rhetorical capacity to find and turn the handle of that metaphorical door to open to the idea of it. Maybe I thought back at the time I wrote that earlier book, somebody would come along later with greater capacity and walk through that door with something magnificent, like a volume of Pitjantjatjara philosophy. Now I should explain my title. Gardiya are white people, like Gunya here in Ghana country, or Balanda in the top end. The process of developing something called Indigenous philosophy in English means it pretty much has to happen in Gardiya institutions. Hence it is for Gardiya. But thought has always been formally elaborated on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries in the old languages. So what is it? I don't know. Probably it's not my business. But I'll forge ahead anyway. 4 sections to this talk. First, I want to explore the interior-exterior contrast, arguing that Indigenous philosophies have a much more outward orientation than Western ones. Then I want to discuss the importance of critique in Indigenous philosophies, that they are not just about themselves, so to speak, but they are taking the debate to situations where so-called Western ideas dominate. Thirdly, I want to discuss spatiality and movement, what it might mean to philosophize on country, and finally pick up on the concept of immanence as opposed to transcendence. So, Indigenous philosophy is still in a situation of exteriority to the state and its constitutive institutions. It's not been admitted yet. The philosophy department doesn't want to admit it exists. The door I spoke about is still only half open. But that, I think, is precisely its value. What is exterior to philosophy is the only thought of philosophical value. I'm thinking of Michel Foucault's 1966 essay on Maurice Blanchot, The Thought of the Outside. How radical is this exteriority? In a banal sense, all institutions of thought and creativity are progressively renewed from the outside, from what Derrida called the margins, from being subject to critique, and through deliberate practices of inclusion. But all these banal movements from outside to inside are no doubt legitimating what is already known, as opposed to maintaining the qualities, the essential qualities of that which is outside. Trying to move the slide on. Cass Sagati, to understand the full impact of this thought on exteriority, he says, we must take into account Foucault's trenchant critique of all interiority, the persistent refusal of a deeper inside. Undoubtedly, it's the totalizing impulse of the dialectical thought of Hegel, with its concepts of reflection, contradiction, unity, totality, and reconciliation, that Foucault resists. Of course, Foucault was always all too aware of the power of Hegelian thought and its interiorization and recuperation of all exteriority. Yet he was also convinced that it's possible to move away from Hegel through a poetics of transgression. In his search for discourses exterior to philosophy, Foucault rejects any form of thought that poses a pure interior space that is the repository of all meaning. This then amounts to the rejection of the traditional interior unities of the author, the book, and the subject. All discourse, according to Foucault, takes place on a level surface. This level surface is no doubt what Deleuze and Guattari would call the plane of immanence, but more on that later. In Australia, the inadmissible radical exterior to the settler colonial state is nothing other than Indigenous thought itself. I think I should give a concrete example. It's a story, it's a kind of yarn. It's a story about a guy called Don McLeod and the first great Aboriginal labourers' strike of the 1940s in Western Australia. This is coming from my book called The Mother's Day Protest. This is my question. What was the philosophy of the fair go? Sorry, was the philosophy of the fair go already in the Western Desert among the Yanyajarra and other mobs, or did whitefellas like the McLeods bring it with them and spread it around? This philosophy, as simple as it was, and based on direct experience, then translated into action, helped create something that people came later to call Don McLeod's law, which is what they called this thing that lay as precious as gold at the heart of the first great Aboriginal labourers' strike action in that Pilbara country in the 1940s. On May 1st, Labor Day, 1946, 800 Aboriginal pastoral workers from 27 stations in Western Australia walked off the job for better pay and conditions. This was the first industrial action by Indigenous Australians and lasted till 1949, making it the longest strike in Australia's history. My discussion here relates to a parallel historical debate in the work of the Subaltern Studies Group, which asks if subaltern groups like Indian peasants or Australian Aboriginal people engaged in revolt, did they come to political consciousness via the agency of some white fella giving them the concept or concepts like the exchange value of labour or resistance? In other words, do they have to be coaxed out of some pre-political stage? Hobsbawm apparently said that. Or did they in fact read the contemporary world correctly, which is the position that the Subaltern Studies School worked to develop on the basis of the evidence they brought forward? But here then are the crucial thoughts from the inside. Sorry, thoughts from the outside. It was the senior men from the desert and the Pilbara who approached the young MacLeod in 1937 with two questions. Why is this no longer our country? And why can't we move around without being arrested? I don't know why they asked me, MacLeod said. Some said I'd taken an old fellow to hospital when no one else would, but I can't remember. I told them to go away. I wanted to be a millionaire working minerals. I didn't want to get mixed up with them. The men persisted. MacLeod went back to his books. 5 years later, this bush lawyer was asked to address a meeting of lawmen at Skull Springs, east of Nalagine, a massacre site. This was a turning point for MacLeod and the Pilbara. There were 23 languages spoken, he recalled. I reckon then and now that they were the most civilized people in the world. Compared to them, we're just a mob of bloody barbarians who stole their country, then ruined it through overstocking. Everything we've got, we stole from them. These are the sorts of questions, like these two, why is this no longer our country and why can't we move around without being arrested, that Indigenous Australians have persistently asked of the colonisers. And my follow-up question is, why are such questions not admitted as philosophical? The persistence of such questions that are the product of deep thought and the fact that the colonisers have difficulty hearing them makes me think that the most important philosophical questions in this country are not the ones that we've inherited from Europe. And yet, some European philosophers have been very helpful, like helping us think from the outside, rejecting, Foucault said, the traditional interior unities of the author, the book, and the subject. The interiorities associated with the categories like author, subject, mind, brain, and the individual are obviously by no means given, but have been built up over centuries in Western societies as a means of organising knowledge and its associated legalities, economies, and ethics. In Indigenous societies, it may be the case that thought is developed explicitly in collective discussion, that is, in spoken language, and not internalised in minds or libraries or books. It's not coming from the brain or going from one brain to another. Non-human agencies such as spirits and animals may be admitted as agents in the determinations arrived at. I take inspiration from Alexis Wright. The earth murmured, the underground serpent living in the underground river that was kilometres wide responded with hostile growls. This was the old war of the ancestors making cyclones grow to use against one another. And a lot of her text is like this. The earth, the serpent, the ancestors, cyclones, different ontological orders that are put into relation here. The principle of relationality, as articulated by Mary Graham, and she extends it to diplomacy, makes this idea of such relations across different orders of reality explicit. It's quite different from the subject-object relation, which is axiomatic in European phenomenology and is deeply explored by Quentin Meillassoux as correlationism in his influential After Finitude. Meillassoux helped us to remove the tyranny of subject-object relations from the story and move to what he calls the great outdoors, where real things can exist without waiting for human scrutiny to bring them into being. How then do we philosophize in a world where everything is engaged in an active, sometimes dramatic fashion, with all kinds of movements affecting each other, the earth, the serpent, the ancestors and cyclones, and no clear input-output portals for intentionality and causality to operate in nice little lines? It's not a passive world sitting there waiting for our disinterested philosophical contemplation. We are in it and of it and attached to it. Prepositions are very philosophical, don't you find? What kind of language could we invent where, as Foucault said, the subject is excluded? And you may as well exclude the object as well. I think it means that Indigenous philosophy has to talk the language of country. Because when the subject and object binary dissolves, that is what remains. And it's what the elders constantly tell us to pay attention to. Such a teaching is in what Briggs and Morgan Briggs and Mary Graham tell us about Aboriginal selfhood. It springs from and is bound up with country or sentient landscape, and hence with ancestor and totemic figures who left their trace in the landscape during the dreaming or creation period that continues to ramify in the present. One result is that each person is not a conscious isolate affirmed through identitarian thought. An Aboriginal equivalent of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, might be, I am emplaced, therefore I am. Country is out there. It is an exteriority replete with things to see, feel, smell, hear, and touch. It's ontologically plural with spirits, ancestors, plants, animals, stars, growth and decay, and there are metamorphoses flashing and shimmering in and among these plural realities, making sure the ensemble hangs together. Dreamings must work something like that. Secondly, Indigenous critique. Max Briety has recently written, the place for a contemporary Aboriginal philosophy is the place for Indigenous critique. This philosophy gives the critique its power and direction, and critique gives this philosophy political possibilities, intensity, and direction too. An Aboriginal philosophy without critique would risk reproducing forms of spirituality which are palatable, unthreatening, and innocuous for modern Australia. Max and I have discussed David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, in which book they define Indigenous critique as that consistent moral and intellectual assault on European society, widely voiced by Native American observers from the 17th century onwards. And they elaborate on Kandiaronk, a chief of the Wendat, who was famous for his rhetoric. Among his people, rhetoric, the power of argument, was very important. Kandiaronk was astounded to hear that the French had a king with permanent power and people were killed for not obeying him. He said that his people were free to wander away if they didn't like what he was saying. Freedom. This concept, along with egalitarianism, was taken back to Europe and apparently had a big influence on Enlightenment thinking. Another angle we have taken is the critique of positivism, which for us is the critique of the reduction of reality to observable evidence. It becomes weaponized in the colonial encounter whenever it's asserted that Indigenous people have beliefs while the colonizers actually know. This creates a one-way flow of knowledge, a translation of beliefs into knowledge, and we argued like this, Max and I, in a recent paper. But what if white fellas had dreamings of their own, not dreaming, but something else? Kim Mahood points out such possibilities when she recounts the ancient Greek myth of Dionysus, the god of the grape harvest, being explained as a European jokopa, a dreaming story, to a group of senior Anangu women. The old ladies concerned about drinking culture, specifically its powers of destruction, were unimpressed by the usual punitive policy talk and the usual statistical analysis, and had asked if there was some deeper power to this drinking thing. They were impressed with the story of Dionysus, in that it spoke of a dreaming from European antiquity that was as real as their dreamings, a resonance here in the present day that enabled them to tell a new story about a man stuck in a log, stuck in addictive behaviour. But it also shows that the dreaming of whitefellas is not emplaced in the same way as dreaming for country. For Mahud, the Anangu's capacity to bring out the story about the man in the log showed they had vast metaphoric resources in their culture waiting to be tapped. And yet it seems the dominance of positivism in whitefellow culture means it's busy pretending it does not have vast metaphoric resources. Whitefellow dreams are able to wander and float through time and even redream themselves along the way, not only as dreams of dreams, but dreams within dreams. It's a contest of titans rather than facts, is it not? So, this whitefellow dreaming must not have stopped when they deposed their ancient gods, when reason is the instrument used to declare that all myth and superstition has been dispelled or despelled. It speaks of just another kind of dreaming, that is positivism. Thirdly, spatiality and movement. Related to exteriority is what some have called the spatial turn in philosophy, which we owe in part to Michel Foucault's Heterotopias, to geographers like Doreen Massey, to Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledge, right through to Isabel Stenger's on cosmopolitics, and the idea of field philosophy in the environmental humanities. In Indigenous Australia, relations to place have always been there and are highly elaborated. And I don't think I need to carry on about that. Elsewhere, I have talked about what I call a ngora aesthetic, a kind of aesthetic derived from camp life in a buru or in a ngora, which is simultaneously 360-degree vision, near and far, then and now, with a multiple sensorium. It's what you enjoy when you go camping, until you succumb to the urge to capture the experience in a rectangular viewfinder. So that brings in the critique of rectangularization, another aspect of what I like to call the Mahud method, as in Kim Mahud, is a process of de-rectangularization. So when Kim Mahud, I've got a picture over here, makes her collaborative map paintings, they turn into beautiful multi-authored, knowledge-laden artworks like this one she did with the Marumili artists. But in the process, she often finds, as they work on the ground, that a rectangular piece of canvas is not enough or not the right shape, as the track they're tracing heads off the edge of the canvas and she has to glue another piece on to accommodate that part of the story. This just reminds us how conditioned our ways of seeing are by rectangles, that simple formal attribute, the frame that offers the affordance of rectangular pictures within it. It was consolidated by European perspectivalism in the Quattrocento, which not only had the rectangular frame, but rectangles diminishing to a point in the distance. This had the important effect of setting the viewer up as the person privileged to have that perspective. In that sense, it invented a particular kind of subject and a particular kind of object. So far from being a natural state of affairs or a normal way of seeing the world, this represents an effort of what Bruno Latour called redistribution. It's not a way of looking at the world at all, because it actually constitutes a world. With this particular mode of world building, Europeans have been working hard to put nature over there, while they invent a particular kind of subjectivity over here in the viewer position. And there are good reasons for doing this. For instance, to do with property and exploitability. So when people take a snap on their phones, they're often obeying the rules of Renaissance capture, and they're orienting the viewers towards eventual rectilinear capture of actual country. This has been done elsewhere through survey lines, grid patterns, blocks with boundaries and fences, states even, and frameworks eventually for buildings. Every snap that's retained and then reposted on Facebook or shown to friends has an aesthetic judgment made about its form and content. The Renaissance inventions of perspective are still in there, like an algorithm creating a distanced nature and a dream of future buildings, beachside properties with picture windows. The rectangle is thus a kind of knowledge valve that only flows one way. So to that, I oppose the Ngura aesthetic, the 360 degrees near and far, then and now, all at the same time, and movement. Walking through country and being led by countrymen is another way of doing Indigenous studies that is de-rectangularized. It's not captured by the rectangles of books, seminar rooms, screens, whiteboards, and so on. Walking through country brings out concepts and feelings which have special names in language, encapsulated by stories. And before you know it, you're part of an argument, not a dispute, an argument that is put by a combination of intelligences, a multi-species intelligence, if you like. Look at the way this river is flowing. See this quiet pool near the bank where the black brim are resting. If you're hungry, you can spear one. This river, these fish have got something going for them. That's my vernacular way of saying process ontology, or better, a mode of belonging and persisting in that place, in their mutual attachments. These things have each other. What we've seen there by this river is a good reason for not damming the river. That is the argument learned by actually going to that place. It's a kind of pragmatics of disclosure. Do this, then something like an arrangement will coalesce and emerge as knowledge. And now you know. So my last thread is about the immanent and the transcendent. In a discussion of Indigenous worlds, it might be useful to borrow a leading anthropologist's recent take on the fundamental philosophical opposition between the immanent and the transcendent. Marshall Sahlins, in the last book he wrote before he died, it's called The New Science of the Enchanted Universe, an Anthropology of Most of Humanity. In that he talks of the divinity of the post-Enlightenment Westerners as notably transcendental, describing a change that came about with monotheism as Christianity purged Europe of classical paganism. Paganism is a word whose etymology, pertinent for us, links it with paganus, Latin for country, an enchanted cosmos with water spirits, nereids, forest spirits, Oreades, household gods, and a host of other gods and demigods. The essential change, Sahlin writes, was the translation of divinity from an immanent presence in human activity to a transcendental other world of its own reality, leaving the earth alone to humans, now free to create their own institutions by their own means and lights. And he refers throughout to non-Western cultures, most of humanity, as being immanentist and sometimes more specifically animist or totemic. And you'll remember that Aboriginal Australia was notably characterised by the early anthropologists as pervasively totemic. Cultures of immanence, Sahlins goes on to explain, are inspirited cultures that have only one world in which people interact with a myriad of non-human subjects, from deities to the dead, all of whom are co-present, visibly or invisibly, with the human beings in one great cosmic polity. There is no other world. So this anthropological description aligns with standard philosophical definitions. For instance, Levi Bryant has got an ontological definition. Oh, there's also a quote from Deleuze and Guattari there too. But Bryant says, the concepts of immanence and transcendence refers respectively to the worldly or what is of the world and that which is beyond, above, or outside the world. Within this framework, the immanent will refer to those entities or creatures of the world that mutually interact with one another and are capable of modifying one another. So the immanent is thus more realistic in the sense of not being otherworldly, and it's more ecological in the sense of humans and non-humans being co-articulated. What disappears with an immanentist ontology is the idea of human exceptionalism and dominance over the rest of the living world. Christian theologians might debate whether God is transcendent or immanent, but only humans actually can approach a state of transcendence through faith and understanding. So according to John Val's gloss on Gregory's theology, the Christian life is continual transcendence of self into the abundant life of God. So while only humans can transcend in the modern era, it's technology that's often evoked as the means by which humans will transcend this world. Secularization, the argument often goes, replaced belief in God with faith in science, modernity, and technology. Well, maybe. But our Indigenous critique has something to say to transcendentalists. In your yearning for the beyond, you have foreclosed on the here below. You've called it nature and let science draw its rules over it. Not the good, curious, inquisitive sciences, only science with a capital S as weaponized by industries in a hurry. The good sciences marvel at what they do not know, at what remains to be disclosed, at the amazing variety and even queerness of life on Earth. The Indigenous critique of transcendentalists is that they think that humans can do it all on their own, as they leave the world behind as if it were not good enough for them. Pioneering Indigenous Australian philosopher Mary Graham would remind them, you are not alone in this world. Graham's idea decenters subjectivity and the Western individualism which evolved out of those spiritual exercises designed for subjective transcendence. Not being alone, being attached, means one must recognize the powers of the immanent that are material and very much of this world. The immanent is a more than human network. But the powers of immanence are not immediately manifest. The relations have to be sought out, described, followed, like a hunter tracking down a kangaroo. So to conclude, these 4 points I've made, gleaned from recent work, don't actually cohere as a philosophy, they're just pathways. I mentioned earlier how I was hoping for something magnificent like a volume of Pijanjajara philosophy, which might be a book, but it might also be a songline people can travel on with custodians of the knowledges and the stories and the songs. If such a work emerged from a thorough knowledge of the Pijanjajara language, it will incorporate the concepts, the semantics, the syntax, as well as the kinds of behavioral practices that go with the words and the literary genres. If it's a book and it's written in the Pijanjajara language, it would not be for gardiya. But if it's translated for them into English, which would no doubt be a challenging task, would it not become a foundational text for a new subdiscipline, Australian philosophy? So that's all from me. Thank you for listening.